Hello and welcome back to another episode. I'm Dr. Venu Bhamidi, and thank you for joining me. I want to start tonight's episode with an image of an earthquake, a sudden, unexpected disruption that can turn your entire world upside down. We're made to look foolish for taking for granted the stable ground that we were enjoying, for thinking that we had invested or built something that could withstand the most rigorous of structural challenges. But little do we expect that seismic activity to mock our feeble attempts at engineering a foundation that we thought was impenetrable. That is divorce. It's a release of pressure that's usually been building along a fault line for years as quiet, unexpressed solitude. A strain that accumulates silently, millimeter by millimeter, into rock that nobody's looking at. And the rupture point is just the finale of a process that started long before anyone was paying attention. Here's what I want you to sit with. In most marriages that end, one person has been standing on the fault line with a seismograph for years, and the other has been asleep or ignorant or stubborn to recognize the fault line was becoming increasingly unstable. Long before an actual separation occurs, a profound emotional disconnect usually takes root, one that operates on a completely different timeline for each partner. One person experiences a conclusion to a process that started some time ago, and the other experiences a sudden and spectacular detonation. And almost everything that goes wrong afterwards, such as the isolation, the social collapse, the way a decent man turns into someone his own friends don't recognize, the way the story transforms into a version that he'll never be able to correct, almost all of it flows from that one asymmetry. Psychological literature on relational dissolution highlights that women are the ones that most frequently execute an emotional exit months or years before making a physical departure. And during this extended period of quiet withdrawal, they undergo a complete psychological grieving process. They process pain, they accept the end of the union, they consult their confidants. They validate their decision through the social media algorithms' self-fulfilling feedback loop. They build a social support safety network. They construct a coherent narrative regarding why the relationship failed such that their interests are well represented and socially protected. And they lay down plans and contingencies for what may come afterwards. By contrast, and generally speaking, men disproportionately operate under a model where they equate functional presence as relationship survival. In other words, if cohabitation, joint routines, and household logistics remain largely intact, men frequently misinterpret this as marital health and relationship stability. Thus, when the final rupture occurs, men are forced into a physical exit before they have even begun emotionally processing why it may have come about, how best to rectify it, and how to manage the period that comes immediately after the rupture. And this creates a severe psychological gap. On day one of the official breakup, one partner is at an advanced stage of processing, planning, and grief. They're grounded, they're emotionally adjusted, and prepared for action, while the other party is plunged into acute trauma, uncertainty, identity loss, denial, and disorientation. Recent findings in Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health demonstrate that while both partners experience heightened psychological distress around a split, the trajectories and social buffering mechanisms differ radically, leaving the unprepared partner exceptionally vulnerable to acute well-being collapses. At this point, I have to be clear so as not to be misunderstood. I'm not referring to cases where there has been genuine physical domestic violence, abuse, or anyone getting hurt. What I'm talking about is the actual mechanics of divorce, something that I struggled to articulate or understand at the time when I was going through it myself. Michael Rosenfeld, a sociologist at Stanford, ran the numbers on a nationally representative American sample, the How Couples Meet and Stay Together survey. And he found that women initiated almost 70% of divorces. Interestingly, Rosenfeld also looked at non-marital breakups, couples who were dating, who were living together but not married. And there, the split was basically even. No statistically significant gender difference at all. Think about what that rules out. It rules out the old, lazy explanation that women are simply more sensitive to relationship trouble, that they feel cracks first because of some essential difference in wiring. Because if that were true, they'd leave dating relationships at the same elevated rate, but they don't. Something specific to the institution of marriage is producing that gap. The female pattern of departure often involves internal processing and cognitive framing long before behavioral execution. It's often a carefully, well thought out plan. When persistent discontent or emotional neglect goes unaddressed, an internal detachment process begins. And during this phase, a partner may gradually cease conflict behaviors, a shift that men often misinterpret as resolution or peace, when it actually signifies emotional resignation. They have lost the desire to fight for the relationship. That resignation is a critical juncture in the relationship breakdown. When emotional investment is lost, it's akin to the moment one is standing at the door of a skydiving plane ready to jump off, because everything after that is often just free fall. And during this quiet departure, the initiating partner undertakes the heavy psychological labor of ending the marriage while still within it. She mourns the loss of the future, works through the acute grief, and comes to terms with the reality of leaving. Importantly, however, the everyday routines that are so familiar remain. She processes the pain without disrupting the stable ground that is holding her up. Crucially, sociological research indicates that women maintain broader, more emotionally expressive social networks throughout adulthood. And she confides in trusted friends, family, or therapists during this withdrawal phase. She establishes an informal support network that pre-validates her eventual departure. She processes her grief in a stable, familiar environment. For the man, the experience is radically different. Men are heavily socialized to focus on structural and financial stability, providing, maintaining routines, and keeping the household operational. When a partner grows quiet, a man rarely infers that a separation plan is being formulated, which is why when the rupture finally materializes, it hits with the force of an unexpected catastrophe. This creates a profound gap in emotional bandwidth. Forced into an immediate physical exit while completely unprepared emotionally, the husband is thrust into acute grief, shock, panic, and bargaining at the exact moment his partner is operating with clear, deliberate logistics. Studies in Frontiers in Psychology confirm that this acute stage often manifests as high-intensity stress, resembling post-traumatic stress. And where men find themselves at a severe disadvantage is that they are then navigating the immediate emotionally charged post-separation period and custody and financial negotiations with severely impaired executive function and emotional dysregulation. And this behavior in turn is used by the other partner to justify the narrative as to why the divorce was called for in the first place. When a marriage collapses, the partner who has been emotionally processing the exit for months holds a distinct structural advantage. She has had the necessary time to articulate a coherent story explaining why the marriage died. In many households, women act as the primary social architects. They manage social calendars, they maintain ties with mutual friends, and they anchor the family within the community networks. The fact that men take a passive role in this ultimately is to their detriment. Men need to take control over their own social networks and relationships, including friendships outside the immediate couple friends that often stem from relationships with the parents of their children's school friends. As the initiating partner processes her grief prior to separation, she naturally confides in this shared network. Long before the public rupture occurs, the surrounding social network is exposed to a consistent account of her distress and effort. By the time the split is formalized, a firm social consensus has formed that she was patient, that she attempted resolution, and was ultimately forced to save herself and the children. And when the blindside hits the husband, he turns to the very same primary social network for support, only to find it has already structurally committed and announced its allegiances. Mutual friends often pull away. They offer cold responses or cut ties entirely. This is a universal phenomenon, and one that men ultimately have themselves to blame. Research on social networks following union dissolution shows that male social circles are significantly more brittle and heavily reliant on the romantic partner as the sole emotional bridge. In the immediate aftermath, social groups seek cognitive simplicity, defaulting to a victim-villain framework. Because the initiating partner shared her emotional narrative first, most articulately, and over an extended time frame, it is not entirely surprising that she naturally occupies a validated victim position. The husband is left in a state of profound social homelessness, losing not only his spouse but also his community, his neighborhood standing, and secondary social networks in a single stroke. Any attempts to vindicate himself seem like an ill-timed attempt to justify his poor behavior or deflect the blame, both of which further compound the narrative of an insensitive, selfish, and emotionally dismissive partner. The sudden removal of a man's family structure, home, and standing creates a state of acute psychological shock. In a matter of days, the man faces a triple loss: the loss of his identity as a co-resident husband and daily father, the loss of unmediated access to his children, and the loss of his physical environment. And so he's plunged into isolation and reeling from disorientation. His autonomic nervous system enters a prolonged state of hyperarousal and emotional dysregulation. A man experiencing acute trauma and panic rarely presents as a quiet, sympathetic figure. Driven by fear, grief, and a desperate attempt to maintain connection to his children, he may react with anger, with erratic communication, with persistent pleading, or intense outbursts. He's operating from a flooded, dysregulated nervous system. However, societal observers rarely evaluate a dysregulated man through the lens of an acute crisis. Instead, his behavioral distress is frequently reinterpreted by the surrounding social circle as the retrospective evidence. His anger is cited as proof of the underlying hostility that drove his partner away. His desperate attempts to demand explanations or contest the narrative are labeled as unhinged or controlling. This dynamic produces a devastating, self-fulfilling prophecy. The more dysregulated a man becomes in the response to the collapse of his entire world, the more he validates the pre-constructed narrative used to discredit him and rationalize his exile. His natural, albeit destructive, reaction to acute blindsiding becomes the very justification cited by former friends, family, and legal bodies to justify his exclusion. The sudden erasure of a man's social identity and community creates persistent trust deficits that can impair future interpersonal relationships for many years to come. And recovery requires a deliberate cognitive shift away from demanding external vindication. As long as a man remains fixated on dismantling the narrative established by his ex-partner, he remains emotionally bound to her frame and is constantly looking to exonerate himself in the eyes of the people who passed the guilty verdict before he even knew that he was going to be convicted. Long-term psychological recovery depends on building an independent emotional infrastructure. For men, the best way to do this is developing a genuine, vulnerable, male-to-male support network that operates independently of the romantic partner and independent of their previous shared friendship networks during the marriage, such that they are offered the impartiality without prejudgment by those who have been conditioned to monitor for the worst behavior that they have been told the man is capable of. It also requires developing emotional literacy to ensure that acute grief does not automatically translate into behavioral reactivity or self-destructive outbursts. Navigating the aftermath of a major relational fracture requires strict emotional regulation under fire. To stand in the wreckage of a life you did not realize was ending is one of the most severe psychological disruptions an individual can experience. It challenges every pillar of identity, self-worth, and mental endurance. However, the immediate aftermath of a rupture, the loss of social networks, the distorted narratives, the temporary instability, they all represent an acute crisis, but not a permanent definition of character. While a relational fracture may dismantle an established life structure, it also exposes where support systems were fragile or overly dependent on a single point of failure, the ex-partner. Long-term healing is not found in litigating the past with an audience that has already taken a side, but in quietly constructing a self-sustaining life, an independent support network, and an internal anchor that cannot be unseated by external narratives. There are two terms that come up frequently in the divorce literature, and that is the initiator and non-initiator. And these two people are not going through the same event on the same clock. The clinical accounts of this are remarkably consistent. The initiator arrives at the point of rupture having already moved through most of the grief. There's fear, resentment, doubt, a long period of withdrawal and distance making, and critically, guilt, which is often managed by fault finding, by building the case, by assembling over months the reasons why the fracture is justified. And by the time they say the words out loud, they are frequently past denial, past bargaining, and somewhere in the vicinity of acceptance. What they feel mixed in with the grief is relief. The non-initiator on the same day is at minute zero, consumed by loss, by shock, by disbelief, and possibly an immediate collapse in self-esteem. So on the day everyone agrees the marriage ended, one person is at the end of a months to years long grieving process and one person is just at the start of it. The unfortunate truth is this: they started leaving 2 years ago. You just found out tonight. When a person spends 2 years processing the end of a marriage, they do not do it in a vacuum. They do it out loud to their sister or best friend or mother or a group chat or a therapist. And that's not scheming, that's just how humans process and metabolize pain. Women are much better than men at suffering together. They are prepared to share their pain in anticipation of either being soothed or understood or both. And frankly, that's the healthy thing to do. And it's the thing that men are catastrophically bad at. And that's almost universal. Where women are good at suffering together, men tend to suffer alone. They deflect their pain or they absorb it inwards, because to express pain means to be, in some ways, less of a man. These conversations that women often have with each other is a way that they bond through sharing difficult experiences. But every one of those conversations is a draft. And over 2 years, these drafts converge. The story gets tighter. The ambiguous incidents get resolved into a direction. The messy bits get sanded off. Not dishonestly, but just in a way any story does when you tell it 40 or 50 times. And a whole network of people slowly come to hold a coherent, sympathetic, and internally consistent account of a marriage that they were never actually inside. They come to learn and in many ways firm up their opinion on how a man is behind closed doors. I would estimate that in a majority of cases this is not a conspiracy. There is no grand evil plan. The woman doing it is not stacking the deck, she's drowning. And talking is how she stays afloat. And in some cases she's right. Some of these narratives are accurate, because some men are truly absent, or contemptuous, or cruel, or checked out for a decade. And if that's you, no amount of structural analysis is going to save you from that, and it shouldn't. However, there is a real category where the account building is deliberate, where allegations get positioned, where the record gets curated with an eye to what it will look like later. And family lawyers see it. Anyone who's worked in this space sees it. And whatever it may be, grief, accuracy, or strategy, the structural effect on the man is identical. He arrives at the worst day of his life to find that the account of his own marriage has already been written. It's been distributed, and it's been accepted. And he has no standing to contest it, because contesting it makes him look exactly like the man in the story. And the worst part, any denial reads as guilt. Any amount of anger reads as proof. And if you're silent, it's interpreted as concession. There is no move on the board that positions the man in line with the true version of events. And there's a reason it's so hard to shift. Because once a network has held a story for several months or years, that story isn't information anymore. It's predetermined fact. And to contradict that fact, those people will have to admit or accept that they've been quietly thinking badly of a decent man for many months or years, and almost nobody's willing to do that. It's far cheaper to conclude that he is now lying about it too, just like they've been told he's lied about so many other things. This is just the version of him that they've been told that he would present himself as after the fact. To this effect, Robert Mulatto wrote in 1987 on how social networks change after separation, and laid out the mechanism as to why the social network often vanishes the moment a couple separate. Mulatto's proposal is that the traditional female partner's role centered around what sociologists called kinkeeping, and that is the maintenance of the extended web of family and social ties. It was the wife or female partner who remembered the birthdays, who organized the dinners, who kept the friendships with the other wives, and thus their husbands. The traditional male role historically has emphasized independence and self-reliance, which, as Mulatto puts it, fails to offer men the benefits of social support at exactly the moment they're most needed. So it's often the case that the marriage isn't just a relationship, it also acts as an outsourced social infrastructure that is predominantly maintained and run by the wife. This work has been discussed more recently. Angelica Ferreira and colleagues at Stanford published a theoretical paper describing what they call man-keeping, the disproportionate effort that women put into compensating for the shrinking of men's social networks. Their framing is that over the past 30 years, men's networks have shrunk substantially relative to women's, and that this pushes men into relying heavily, sometimes exclusively, on a romantic partner for emotional support. They frame it as a burden on women, and to be honest, it is, but run the same finding forward one step and you get the male catastrophe. If she is the sole node connecting you to your own emotional life, then losing her doesn't just cost you a relationship, it costs you the entire network. The real kick in the teeth, however, is that the network doesn't just disappear. It remains, but has usually picked a side. The husbands of the ladies who first befriended the ex-wife feel compelled to stand alongside their partner. So when the wife leaves, the entire village convenes, deliberates, and seems to find an issue against you, in most cases for reasons that have very little to do with the merits or the actual truth, because they heard the story from her first, and because they heard it 40 times, because she's the one who will keep organizing the dinners, because the wives in those couples have made a decision and the husbands aren't going to fight it. And as I reflected back on the loss of my social network, I identified 4 types of social exits. The first is the exit of the loyalist, and that is a person that was friends with your ex-wife first before they were friends with you. And that's not betrayal, that's just the truth about a relationship you misfiled. The second exit is that of a coward, and this is the one that does a lot of damage, because that person was actually your friend, your actual friend, the bloke you spent hours postulating life with, solving the world's problems over a few too many beers, and the bloke that you made some great memories with. And while he might not take a side, he suddenly just gets busy. His replies get slower and shorter, and he becomes less responsive. And it's not that he doesn't like you, he's just decided that being near you is socially expensive, because his wife has adopted the opposite position to you on it, and possibly because he has no idea what to say to a grown man who might break down or cry. So exiting slowly and gradually becomes an easier path. The third exit is that of the conscripting friends, the ones who are actually genuinely fond of you and believe that you got a rough deal. And they even say it, but usually in private. And then they go back to a house where saying it again has a cost, either because their partner has also adopted a side or because even mentioning your situation leads to a difficult and unpleasant conversation with their partner. So they distance themselves. But whenever you do happen to see them, they continue to show you support, but again, only in private. And the fourth exit is the one that really guts men and does a lot of damage. And thankfully, this is not something that I've experienced personally, but many men do. And that is the exit from your own family who may choose to maintain a relationship with your ex, sometimes with more warmth than they show you. And the reason is usually not disloyalty, it's the grandchildren. Because the ex-wife ends up with the children most of the time, and a relationship with her is the price of access to their grandkids or nephews or cousins. Add those all together and you get the specific and disorientating fact of the post-separation loneliness. Almost nobody dramatically abandons you. There is no confrontation, no falling out, nothing that you can specifically point to. The village just gets quieter week by week until you notice the phone hasn't rung in a month. And you cannot name a single person who did anything wrong. Roger Potilny analysed the Australian Bureau of Statistics General Social Survey and found something that's important to understand. He noted that separated fathers reported greater social contact than partnered men, but less social support. And that is the signature of a man surrounded by people he cannot talk to. He's at the school gate, he's at the handover, he's at the barbecue where everyone's polite. He's never alone in a room, but he's alone in a crowd that knows something about him and isn't discussing it with him. And Paterni's conclusion then was that separated fathers felt less supported and less empowered than partnered fathers and partnered mothers, or even separated mothers, every other group. And this is the real live risk to their mental health. And this was published in 2012, almost 15 years ago. So now let's put a man in that position and watch what happens. Let's exclude violent, adulterous men or those with substance abuse problems. Those men have invited consequences onto themselves, so let's remove them for a second. Let's look at good men. Let's look at a man with no risk factors that pose any harm to his children. And then let's ambush him with the end of his marriage. We will then reduce his access to his children to 2 to 3 nights a fortnight, or sometimes completely. We'll remove his house. We'll remove half or 2/3 of his assets. We'll remove a large share of his income. And we'll remove his identity as a husband and most of his identity as a father. And then let's also remove every single person he would normally talk to about it. And after all that, let's ask him to behave impeccably. And that's what we demand of good men in this situation. In the 12 months where he is the most physiologically and psychologically dysregulated, we demand that he conducts himself with total composure. Every text message is used as a potential evidence. Every raised voice at handover is potentially a filing of a restraining order. Every drunk 2 a.m. phone call is a harassment attempt. The very period of maximum consequence is precisely aligned with the period of minimum capacity. A man in acute grief who's sleep-deprived, isolated, and terrified about his children is not operating with an intact prefrontal cortex or his total mental faculties about him. And that's not an excuse, it's basic physiology. In that very difficult stage, it is incredibly hard to modulate your impulse control, perspective taking, the ability to sit in a feeling for more than 90 seconds without acting on it. And sleep is the first thing to go, which means the deficit compounds every night for months on end. And under that load, men, trained since boyhood into one socially permitted emotional channel, convert almost everything into that one output that they have, and that one emotion that is expressive, which is anger. A man's fear comes out as anger. His grief comes out as anger. His sadness of being deleted from his kids' lives comes out as anger. His shame comes out as anger. His confusion, humiliation, panic about the kids, anger. And in some unfortunate situations, that anger translates into unacceptable and dangerous behavior, which then reaffirms the social network's opinion about him and strengthens the case against him. I know this all too well. It's something I've personally experienced. The amount of anger I felt during my grieving process was nothing like I ever felt before. Thankfully, I managed to regulate myself enough to not allow myself to slip down a dark path or do things I would regret. But that is not always the case with every man. Actions taken in the midst of poor emotional expression have lifelong consequences for some men. Nobody understands that he's frightened and the ground he's standing on has just given way. So that man ends up sending the message that he shouldn't. He says the thing at the door he shouldn't have said. He blows up at a mate unnecessarily. He drinks more than he should. He becomes a version of himself he would not have recognized 2 years earlier and will be ashamed of for the 20 years afterwards. And every one of those moments is read as evidence, as confirmation, as the thing she'd been describing all along. The network watches him come apart and they say to each other quietly, well, now we see it. The devastation is interpreted as though it were the cause and that she was right all along. His reaction to losing everything becomes retrospective justification as to why he deserved to lose it. And the more devastated he is, the more it looks like she was right. And unfortunately, there's no way to win that. The only exit is to not enter it. And almost nobody knows that at the time when they're in the thick of it. And what makes this a years-long event rather than a few bad months is that each loss removes the resource you need to survive the next one. For example, loss number 1, the marriage, which for many men was also the therapist, the confidant, the diary, the only relationship in which they said true things out loud. Then there's a second loss, which is the network, which, as we've established, was largely hers to begin with, and has now made a finding. Loss number 3 is the children, or the dailiness of them, because the term access undersells it. What's lost isn't always visitation, it's the ordinary, unremarkable, unphotographed texture of parenting. The school run, the bath time, the argument about homework, the being there when nothing's happening. And fatherhood relocates into a schedule. Loss number 4 is the home. Not sentimentally, but practically, the physical infrastructure of social life. It's very hard to host anyone from a one-bedroom rental you took because it was what was left after settlement. Loss number 5 is money, which quietly forecloses on the standard advice. Join a club, get a hobby, see a psychologist. All of that costs money that the man may no longer have at the exact moment he needs it. Now, after saying all of that, I reflected on the immediate aftermath of my divorce, and I had some key takeaways or principles or lessons. Lesson number 1 is that the head start is not, in most cases, a weapon. It's a symptom. If she spent 2 years grieving in advance, that means she spent 2 years in a marriage that was already unbearable to her, and did it largely alone, while you experienced those same 2 years as usual and routine and seemingly fine. That gap is not evidence of her cunningness, it's evidence of how much she wasn't reaching you. And lesson 2 is about being blindsided. And when we claim to be blindsided, sometimes that claim is just our perception, not the facts. Sometimes men are told, and possibly many times they're told, in an unfamiliar language, in ways that were indirect, not entirely clear, or perhaps in a dialect they didn't quite understand. And that's still tragic, but it's a different kind of tragedy, and has a different lesson. So as men, we need to learn to spend the time to get to know another language, their language. And every woman has a different language, different dialects, different tonality, and different expressions of distress. And I wouldn't necessarily call it anything as grandiose as the language of love, but at the very least, it's a language of understanding and empathy. And lesson number 3 was to build our own village, because the village didn't only leave because it was a village she constructed. Some of the village left because you never took the time to build anything meaningful with it. If your entire social existence was downstream to your wife or ex-wife's administration, that arrangement was fragile before she left. And it would have failed on the day she died or got sick or took a job in another city. The divorce didn't create that vulnerability, it just revealed it. And the fix isn't a grievance, it's a project that begins in building a meaningful community by yourself, on your own terms and schedule, with people who offer you added meaning and value for the new version of you. So we need to construct that network in a way that doesn't make us vulnerable and dependent on our partner in any way. And the easiest places to start are men's communities, whether that's a sporting team, a trade, a men's shed, a regular pub, bar, catch-up, or bingo night. And lesson 4 was to stop trying to win the narrative. Because it's the single biggest waste of a man's first few months or years. You will not out-argue multiple years of drafts and character assassination that has been distributed through a network that's already passed the verdict on you, and every attempt to do so will confirm it. Accept that the story will be wrong for a while, probably a long while, and there is no version of this where you can correct it by force. What corrects it sometimes is years upon years of conduct, and only for the people who are never ever going to bother looking. And lesson number 5 was to never send messages when you're flooded. Avoid the dysregulation trap, because this is the highest cost failure mode and it is preventable by dreadfully boring means. Write the message, but don't send it. Draft it in a notes app or somewhere else, never in a thread. The 24-hour rule on anything emotional. No handover conversations beyond logistics. And accept the humiliation of a communication app if it's a high conflict separation. That friction is a point that will save you years of pain. Lesson number 6 was understanding that this was the highest risk window of your adult life and acting accordingly. Separated men are statistically in the most dangerous period they will ever occupy, so we need to engage with professional help. If the brain is screaming the argument that children are better off without you, that's not a conclusion, it's a symptom of the state that you're in. And lesson number 7 was to protect the children from the narrative war, including the version where you're winning. Every man in this position has the fantasy of the day the kids finally understand what happened. Don't try to accelerate that day, because a child recruited into the case loses both parents, one to the story and one to the telling of it. So our job is to be so consistently present, boringly reliable, free of commentary, that in 10, 15 years, the children have drawn their own conclusion from evidence that they've already existed. Perhaps even from the very same evidence that was used against you. And remembering that it's a long-term game, and it's the only one you can actually control. As I close, I want to come back to the earthquake analogy that I started the episode with. After a major quake, the aftershock can run for years. The ground keeps moving long after all the spectators and visitors and vehicles leave. And the buildings that come down in the aftershocks aren't usually the ones that were badly built. They're the ones that took the first hit and were never repaired because everyone assumed the event was over. And that's what can happen to men after divorce. Not the rupture, but the years and years of ongoing small collapses in a structure that nobody inspected. So if you're in the middle of this earthquake, the fact that you didn't see it coming does not mean that you were stupid. It means that you were on the other side of an asymmetry that almost no one explains to men. The fact that your friends went quiet does not mean you were never worth knowing. It means you were connected to them through a cable that ran through someone else, and that you didn't know that until it was cut. And the fact that you behaved badly in the worst year of your life does not mean the story about you was true. It means you were dysregulated in public with no shock absorbers and every witness taking notes. If this episode landed, send it to the man you've been checking in on, or who's in the middle of the storm I've just described, regardless of how close you may or may not be to him. That show of solidarity means more than you think. I remember all those people who didn't need to reach out, but did. But more importantly, I remember all those who really should have reached out, but didn't. And they know who they are. And, as Oprah always says, take care of yourself and each other. I'm Dr. Venu Bhamidi. I'll catch you for the next episode.